So we're from Russell Cook. We're a top 100 law firm with a very, very wide range of practice areas. So all the way from corporate and real estate, property litigation, through to our children team, who do some fantastic work with children in care, our criminal law team, and a big private client department. Catherine and I, we are in our charity and social business team. So we act for charities and social businesses and philanthropists on essentially, hopefully anything that they have legal issues about or require legal advice on. We have slightly different focuses, myself and Catherine. I'm a governance specialist, so I specialise in how charities are governing and any kind of governance issues that might arise. And Catherine has a people focus, so is an employment lawyer by background, but also has a wider view on people-related matters. So when it comes to, for example, trustee disputes and issues, so not just employment. We've got 20 minutes to start talking about ESG for heritage organisations and projects, and then we're going to hand over to Helen, who is going to focus on the environmental side and run us through, I understand, a case study. So we're going to be talking about, firstly, what it is, why you should care about it, whether charities are caring about it, and what to think about when you're developing and putting policies into practice. So, as I said, our focus is on not-for-profits, charities, charitable trusts, community groups, organisations. I appreciate some of you might be here from local authorities. They will necessarily have potentially different regulations applying to them. So we'll be focusing on the charity sector, but do bear in mind there may be additional regulations depending on the makeup of your organisation. So let's see if this moves through. No, it doesn't. Oh dear. How do we get through to that? I'm sorry, you're going to have a sneak peek of the slides as we go through. Very, very professional as ever. So what is oh, there we go. Well done, Kathy. Thank you. What is ESG? Is it more than just a corporate buzzword? So it's a well-established concept in the corporate world, and lots of non-profit companies are getting increasingly visible on their ESG policies and public reporting. So for-profit companies, we find they're focusing on this. They want to really demonstrate their credentials to their employees, to their investors, to their stakeholders, to their customers, and it's really gaining a lot of traction. In the charity sector, though, there's been a bit of a hesitance to put charities at the forefront of this, even though it feels like it should be a natural fit. There was a survey by the finance firm RSM that did a review of, I think, 114 charities and found that not a single one of them had an ESG section on their website or mentioned or had a section in their annual report. And actually only 1 in 4 included ESG related content in their accounts. So, I mean, are they not doing it, or are they just not shouting about it? For us, it feels like actually charities are doing a lot of this. They just haven't got into the habit of packaging up the programs that they're running as ESG and also shouting about it. So starts with environmental. So that's sustainability, climate risk, supply chain, making ethical choices. So that ranges from the legal side of things, so for example, reporting on your greenhouse gas emissions, through to the voluntary actions that you can take to reduce your carbon use, you can carbon offset, or increase the environmental sustainability of your building or your suppliers. And again, Helen's going to be focusing on that. Social tends to cover equality, diversity, and inclusion, and these are all matters that Catherine's going to be talking about with her focus on people. And finally, governance. So I did understand that actually it started with governance at one point, and it was GES, but the person who came up with the term didn't like that acronym. But essentially, good governance is almost at the heart of all of this. If you don't have good governance, everything else falls away. So that's about your organizational purpose. And here's where the charity sector have a large advantage, because purpose is at the heart of every charity, what they are there to achieve. Not necessarily the same for corporates, which I think is why it comes easier and more naturally to the charity sector. It's about good leadership, leading with integrity, properly managing risk, and being both transparent and accountable. So good governance, there's a range of duties and best practice. So in terms of legal requirements, there are the statutory obligations in relation to decision making and the duties that decision makers need to take into account when doing that. There are requirements to keep records of decision, and there are requirements about accountability. So for example, laws about your accounts and what needs to be disclosed in there. In terms of regulatory requirements, a number of organisations are subject to different regulators. So almost every charity will be subject to the Charity Commission, and that will set out standards of governance that it would require charities to comply with. So that includes conflicts of interest management, safeguarding policies is another key one. Other regulators that might be relevant are people like the Ofsted or the Care Quality Commission. And again, they will set standards of what they see to be good governance. Partners and funders. So we're finding that increasingly stakeholders, both in the for-profit and not-for-profit sector, are asking to see governance policies and evidence of robust management, good leadership, and solid decision-making. Funders in particular, particularly where they come from the corporate space, so corporate funders or sponsors, who come from a world where ESG is much more established, may well be more attracted to your organisation if you're promoting good governance and speaking their language by packaging it up under this ESG umbrella. Best practice. So obviously good governance begets good governance, because if you have the right processes in place to have good governance procedures, then you will find that you'll have a much easier job of attracting people to trustees, volunteers, employees, and also retaining them.
So social, and what we really mean by this is equality, diversity and inclusion, which is underpinned by legal duties. For example, the duty not to discriminate unlawfully under the Equality Act. That applies to employees, service users, members and office holders. And depending on your size, organisations might also have modern slavery reporting and gender pay gap reporting too. As Pippa's sort of gone through in quite some detail, it also supports good governance to have an EDI strategy in place. An emphasis on EDI can equate to effective leadership and decision making by reflecting different perspectives, experiences and skills, including, where applicable, current and future beneficiaries and service users. It may bring the organisation closer to those it serves. Sorry, just on that last bit as well, a board that commits to equality, diversity and inclusion are more likely to set a positive example as well, and a tone for the charity by following an appropriate strategy for delivering its purpose and setting inclusive values and culture. Employees are an important stakeholder in an organisation, and there's an increasing focus within organisations on transparency and communication in the workplace. So the social aspect of ESG should be context specific. It should set clear organisational approaches to equality and diversity and inclusion in line with the organisation's aims, strategy, culture and values. This is to be supported by appropriate plans, policies, milestones, targets and timelines. So some of the benefits and challenges of ESG, we've already discussed quite a number of them, but as the public demonstrates a greater awareness and concern about the environmental impact of organisations and concern about their attitudes towards equality, not-for-profit organisations may find that supporters, volunteers and donors are starting to look for ESG information when deciding which causes to support. It's increasingly easy to find information, and there's a growing expectation on being able to find information on an organisation's website. Organisations that proactively publish the steps they're taking may find themselves at an advantage, for example, when trying to attract corporate partners or sponsors. And there was some suggestion that ESG initiatives contribute towards organisation sustainability. For example, by reducing costs, by becoming more energy efficient, and as I mentioned, by attracting and retaining investment. Many not-for-profit organisations may find that they are actually already carrying out some ESG activities or have ESG strategy, but it's just not named as such. And in this way, many organisations may find that they are naturally aligned with ESG concepts already. And there is also a breadth of opportunities to engage in ESG as it covers a huge, wide range of issues. Some of the challenges for organisations when looking at ESG, although it's embedded as in the corporate culture already, it's largely unregulated. For the most part, ESG is voluntary, and it can be inconsistent in terms of the reporting. Added to this, environmental issues such as biodiversity, for example, are difficult to quantify, and social issues are renowned for being sort of difficult to standardise. And it's therefore really hard to monitor the progress or success of ESG initiatives. There are also some reputational risks, thinking about culture wars and the pursuit of some charities or not-for-profit organisations as what might seem a woke agenda, which has led to some damaging media coverage for some organisations, as well as challenges by MPs and the Charity Commission. The National Trust is an obvious example of that. Also there's the need to ensure that noble targets and statements are also backed up by measurable actions. An impressive ESG statement, for example, has nothing sitting behind it which could expose an organisation to allegations of woke washing, greenwashing or unethical behaviour. You may have seen in the news today that the HSBC has been accused of greenwashing, and some of its adverts have been banned. I think that's it, that's us. And we will hand over to Helen.
Thank you both. As I said, we'll take any questions for Catherine and Pippa at the end, but Helen, if you want to get going.
Okay, thanks, Catherine. Thank you, Pippa. Everyone hear me okay? Yeah, cool. Okay, my name's Helen Shellabert. I'm a chartered surveyor and at the moment an asset manager on a commercial property portfolio. I am just a heritage enthusiast and therefore a volunteer for the London Historic Buildings Trust, just helping where I can. As Catherine and Pippa mentioned, my background is probably more the E of the ESG, but what I really wanted to do today was to provide a practical strategy for how to go about developing an ESG policy. And my real hope for today is that everybody comes away with one useful piece of information that they can take back to their organisation, charity, local authority, whoever, and put into action, basically. So I've developed a 9-point plan, and I'm going to run through that now. So number one, now mine's not moving. Right, sorry, gosh. Okay, there we go. Know your organisation. This seems obvious, but of course it's really important to appoint somebody to lead on the development of the ESG policy. And then it's all about brainstorming. Write it all down. Who are you? What is your mission? What are your values? Who are your stakeholders? And ultimately, what does ESG mean for your organisation? Stakeholder mapping is actually a really, really interesting activity. And I would recommend that you all grab a piece of paper and just spider diagram. Who are the stakeholders? This could be internally your employees, your trustees, or externally, this could be your shareholders, your investors, your regulatory bodies, your local community, literally everybody who your organisation touches, who might have some say or who you might need buy-in from with your overall ESG policy. So what I should also have said is, as I go through these, I'll explain the context of how I went about this when I was drafting and writing the trust's ESG policy. So know your organisation. For the trust, obviously that was reviewing the values that's already there, the governance structure that's already in place, doing the stakeholder mapping exercise, and looking at historic England guidance, Heritage Lottery Fund guidance, all of whom have their own ESG policies and have their own increasing requirements for what they expect of people applying to them for grant funding. Peer research is another one. Create an inventory. Catherine and Pippa touched on this, but what are you already doing? Many of you, most of you, all of you will be doing something already that falls under the umbrella of ESG. It's just not badged that way. Whilst you're looking at what you do already, I would really recommend you have a look, if you haven't already, at the UN Sustainable Development Goals. These were adopted in 2015, and they provide a really useful framework and sort of signposting towards where we really want to be moving as a society. So these goals are things such as alleviating poverty, creating sustainable cities and communities, and alleviating hunger and things like that. And whilst they're quite general, actually it's quite interesting to try and align your ESG targets with those sustainable development goals, because I think that really allows you to kind of track tangible progress as you go along. I've mentioned this already, but what are your peers doing? This is all about collaboration, not competition. I think there is a competitive edge to this at the moment, because the people that are at the forefront of this are going to be the most attractive when it comes to applying for funding or trustees or whatever it is. But ultimately, we should all be sharing information and best practice. So, for example, with the trust, we had a look at like the Soil Association have a really strong ESG policy. The Creative Land Trust, some of you may heard of, work in London. They've also got an ESG policy. So we had a look at those, and just to see where there were things we had in common or other strengths that we had. The trust, obviously, as Hannah has already outlined, has got a really strong social impact cause, and ultimately via the work that they do in projects, there's an easy win with reducing and minimizing carbon emissions throughout the projects. So already really well placed to move forward on this. 3, define your priorities. Again, enormous topic, as we know. You can't do everything. So an ESG policy that's going to succeed really needs to hone in on exactly what it is that you want to be doing in the short, medium and long term. Where can you build upon existing actions? And then also what areas probably need more work, where actually you need to do a bit more research, and importantly, how you'll measure that progress. So for the trust, I've created an overarching policy with quite a lot of information in there, but this is supported by a list of short-term actions, which we're planning to kick off prior to the policy being formally signed off, just to get going really on the progress. And the other thing that will take a bit of time, but it's just really important to make sure that we embed sustainability goals into the project briefs that we're sending out there. So it's going to take a bit more work, but the plan is to just get that going even before the policy's embedded, so that we can actually start moving forward. 4, then start developing your strategic plan. So Catherine and Pippa have covered this. Environmental, precise actions to minimise carbon footprint, social, effective actions to address socio-economic disparity in the community or region in which you operate, and governance, robust compliance with the relevant standards. And then how are you going to integrate that into the overall business plan? Again, I've mentioned it before, but an ESG policy shouldn't really be a policy that sits in isolation. This should be embedded throughout everything your organisation is doing and wishes to do for it to really be successful. So for the trust, this meant that I developed a framework based on the principles of ESG as 3 core titles. And then within that, I refined that down to our operations, our projects, and our stakeholders and suppliers. Now, if any of you do have any knowledge of the E, then you will probably recognise that those 3 subsections actually align to scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. So this might be a topic for another day, but ultimately scope 1 carbon emissions are those directly generated by your organisation. So employees travelling to work, using energy in the office, those sorts of things. Scope 2 emissions are those which are generated sort of indirectly, but via your work. So anything that's sort of in your control but slightly out of your control. And then scope 3 emissions is where it gets really sticky for people. Those are emissions which occur up and down your value chain or your supply chain. So the emissions, for example, in my work, the cleaning contract, the waste companies, all the other suppliers that I use to help manage our commercial portfolio, it's the emissions that they generate. So you can have an influence, but your influence will only take you so far. And that is the hardest of the emissions to control. But if you can start small, then that's great. 5, organizational culture, absolutely critical, the most critical bit. And this is the bit that I would encourage all of you to take something from this today. Who will promote that ESG policy? Who will be the change maker? How will you effectively communicate this policy to everybody internally and externally? And how will you get buy-in? You need buy-in from all levels of the organization. Every single role in the business needs to feel that they are on the journey. It's great to have obviously somebody responsible for ESG, but it really doesn't and shouldn't be a siloed role. Everybody needs to feel that they have a part to play. So for the trust, we already have a trustee for social impact, and I think it's TBC, but hopefully she will expand her role to be the trustee for ESG. We've got already buildings, finance and risk committees, and there's some discussion at the moment about who will be responsible for ESG, because ultimately they sort of straddle all 3 of those committees. But that's just an example of who could take it forward. Then we'll obviously work out how we integrate the reporting, the ESG reporting, into the overall annual reporting. And then, of course, there's internal training, which the lovely Hannah's obviously in charge of, and CPD internally and externally. But I can't stress enough how important this section is. 6, measure your progress. Again, a little bit tricky, but for some of you, like the trust, who already have a social impact measurement framework or who measure their impact, this actually should be relatively straightforward. Always record your baseline position, agree your key indicators, which are going to help you measure your data qualitatively and quantitatively on each project. And agree the frequency of measurement. So for the trust, we will obviously be measuring this project to project, but also there will be an annual reporting on it, and probably quarterly. I've put quarterly in there because that will be the committees who'll catch up what's working, what's not. So the trust, as I've mentioned, have this framework already, and we are just expanding and building on that to include environmental targets. So if you already, as I say, just to stress, go back and see what you're already measuring and how. 7, report and communicate. So who's responsible for the reporting and how? We've also touched upon sort of publishing. I think Catherine mentioned the website. You do publish your targets and achievements. It's a scary thing, I think, to come out and say, I'm going to be net zero by 2030, and you haven't got a Scooby how you're going to achieve it. But ultimately, I think the more people that actually start to publish their targets, the more it will help us collectively push towards making some tangible progress. So include a section on your website. You know, obviously you've got to be careful, as Catherine outlined, because of the greenwashing. But ultimately, I think, you know, if we all have a duty to try and inspire each other, basically, and to share best practice with our partners and our peers and our stakeholders. So where are we with the trust? Well, we are in the stage that the board are reviewing with a view to agreeing and formalising the ESG policy. It will then most likely be added to the website. We will include the ESG reporting in the annual report. And we have our measurement framework, which we'll agree. And then as an ongoing basis, there'll be training and information sharing from project to project. Finally, sort of learn. Obvious one, but it is an evolving topic. Nobody is really an expert yet on ESG. Obviously, there's a lot of people talking about it, but there's also a lot of learning happening because it's constantly moving and changing. So it's really important to just stop and work out what is working and what's not, particularly obviously for charities who may be committing extra resource and cost to overlaying some of this ESG on your projects. CPD, if you know, as I've already said, if you can sort of share the information, that's great. Keeping up to date with regulatory requirements. Obviously in my industry, the EPC, Energy Performance Certificate, and MEES regulations are really, really significant. So I have a portfolio of D to E properties, which we have to bring up to EPC ratings of A or B by 2030, and it's an enormous task. So it's important to keep up to date with that. And then, you know, where you can, get involved with roundtable discussions, feedback loops, and etc. Finally, recalibrate and evolve. I really believe that ESG is not a standalone policy, as I've already said. It is something that should be integrated into business as a whole. And wouldn't it be wonderful if every business in the entire world was completely focused on the environmental, social, and governance aspects of its work? But ultimately, I truly believe that in the future, the ones that are will be more successful. It will involve innovation and probably some uncomfortable change for some, which is why I've stressed the buy-in from all stakeholders and levels of the organisation. And I think finally the takeaway is, you know, don't be disheartened by the task ahead. Be brave, set some big targets within your organisations if you can, or if you don't feel comfortable to do that, just start small. And if none of you have heard of it, I'd really encourage you to go away and Google the idea of the flourishing enterprise, which is a really wonderful idea. And it's all about how we should really be collectively pushing towards positive change rather than just, it's great to minimize the negative outcomes, and we should all be, you know, achieving the Paris, you know, the limit of 1.5 degrees on global warming. But ultimately, rather than just avoid the negative, let's really try and make some tangible change, because this is the time and this is the opportunity. Finally, I've just put here some resources for you to go and have a look at. Some which are very relevant to charities, obviously with the Heritage Lottery Fund and Historic England. Historic England's page, actually, I was really impressed by. But then there's a couple of other things for any financial reporting interests out there. The International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation genuinely is actually quite interesting, all about integrated reporting. And one I haven't put on here, but I'd love to send around, is something called Couch to Carbon Zero. So again, if there is one thing you could take away Couch to Carbon Zero. It's a website for busy people, 10 days, sprint to carbon zero. Every day they give you something that you can do at home, and you know, if you could take that away, challenge all your colleagues to have a go at it, just to start to disseminate all these ideas through everybody in the organization, so everybody feels that they are, you know, collectively working towards some positive change. And yeah, I hope you found that helpful.